It's interesting. After all the grandstanding, the left-sounding speeches, and the self-righteous denunciations of any to the right of Jesse Jackson, the Albany Conference decided that their next big strategic move would be to build the September Washington, D.C. demonstration called by the unions and fulsomely supported by the Democratic Party. The event was organized for and by the Democrats as an answer to the Glenn Beck rally, you know, the big pray-in they had, and designed to energize people to get out and vote for Democratic candidates. The rally featured no anti-war speakers, and the so-called anti-war contingent was practically invisible. And that's how the union leaders and the Democratic Party politicians behind the rally wanted it. After all, they were not going to go up against a war that is being fought by a Democratic Party commander-in-chief. Now that Bush's wars are Obama's wars, the anti-war left is silent. Oh, they still maintain they oppose the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, but that's only in theory. In practice, they seek to subordinate the anti-war issue to the long litany of so-called progressive causes. Their so-called strategy is to channel anti-war activism into building whatever rally or candidate the union bosses are sponsoring that day. What galls me most of all is the lack of urgency, the complacency with which these self-proclaimed leaders approach the question of how to stop the U.S. war machine. I find it galling that people who are so quick to accuse others of racism would be so focused on the trials and tribulations of an American auto worker who makes $50 an hour over that of a dirt-poor Pakistani villager whose family has just been decimated by a drone attack. The great downfall of the U.S. anti-war movement has been its dogged insistence on a multi-issue approach. It's gotten to the point where these rallies all have the same character and tone. The whole litany of grievances is laid out. And every victim group gets to lodge its particular complaint. Opposition to our foreign policy of global intervention is just a single note in a symphony of protest. No wonder there are no more anti-war protests coming from the left. They bored themselves to death. And us too, I might add. Well then, where else can we turn? After all, there's no tradition of opposition to war and imperialism on the right among conservatives, is there? Well, I'm glad you asked, because as a matter of fact, there is. This election season, we've heard an awful lot from the Tea Partiers about the Constitution, and specifically about the Founding Fathers, who are held up as exemplars to be emulated. Now that's a good idea as far as I'm concerned, because if we hearken back to the legacy of the Founders and take it seriously and apply it to the 21st century, there would be no Patriot Act, no spying on Americans by their own government, and certainly no TSA agents poking and prodding American citizens every time they want to get on a damn plane. And there would be no American empire either. You know, I've often found myself of being called an isolationist. Now, of course, there is no such thing as an isolationist. Humans naturally gather together in communities, and the only isolationists are those holy hermits of time past who went out into the desert to commune with God. Yes, but they always came back, didn't they? Not least of all because they wanted to communicate their sacred visions to the people. The international division of labor, the social and cultural benefits of free trade and easy immigration, the global flow of information made possible by the internet, these are all to the good. However, there are some things that we want to be isolated from: war, tyranny, social and economic turmoil, isolation from these negative phenomena is much to be desired. The isolationist label was first used by the enemies of peace as an epithet that made war opponents out to be unrealistic. It was repeated endlessly by the pro-war media, or do I repeat myself? The word became common parlance. But what is today reviled as isolationism, which is simply a policy of non-intervention in the affairs of other nations, is deeply rooted in our history, in American history. As the anti-isolationist historian Selig Adler pointed out, quote, "The American Revolution was itself an act of isolation, for it cut the umbilical cord to the mother country," end quote. Were the American revolutionists isolationists because they wanted to isolate themselves from the tyranny of the British king? And not only from him, but from all the crowned heads of Europe, who looked on the North American wilderness as a fertile field for the growth of their empires. Not only England, but the Dutch, the Spaniards, and the French, whose revolutionary fervor devoured the revolutionaries and finally turned its fury outward as Napoleon rampaged across Europe and sought to export his revolution to the New World, to no avail. The American Revolution, as the conservative writer Garrett put it in 1956, quote, "was a pilot flame that leaped the Atlantic and lighted Holocaust in the old world, but its character was misunderstood and could not have been reproduced by any other people. It was a revolution exemplary," end quote. This revolution exemplary gave birth to a new world, bereft of the encrusted evils, the ancient hatreds, the convoluted obsessions of the old. This sense of the unique American character permeated the revolutionary propaganda of the rebellious patriots. Freedom from European militarism was one of the great benefits of independence, touted in Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense. In 1783, at the end of the Revolutionary War, Congress passed a resolution rejecting American entry into the European League of Armed Neutrality, so-called, declaring that the 13 states, quote, should be as little possible engaged in the politics and controversies of the European nations as possible, end quote. This is the founders talking. The classic statement of the founders' foreign policy is, of course, George Washington's farewell address. Caught in the crossfire of radical Jeffersonians and the pro-British Federalists led by Alexander Hamilton, George Washington sought to steer a middle course, warning against what he called permanent inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others. But he went further than this and said, quote, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled in perfect good faith. Here, let us stop," end quote. And we did stop. After the Treaty of Alliance with France that aided and speeded the victory of the American revolutionaries, the American government did not enter into another formal alliance with a foreign power until the Second World War. A course that ensured our independence, preserved our republican institutions, and avoided the growth of foreign influence in our internal politics. This was the American policy, the policy of non-intervention, which all the founders basically endorsed, most notably Thomas Jefferson, that subversive, who called for entangling alliances with none in his first inaugural